Ireland has just voted for abortion. The journalists have flown across the world to be here. Finally, we've gotten with the times. But instead of a terrible beauty, a new cruel reality was really born. This was ultimately a loss, only they didn't know.
Irish T-shirt.
The mob had forgotten something in their haste.
A quiet revolution.
We're disgusted at what happened to children in some of the institutions, how babies were treated after they were born, and then we just go and vote to take away the right of babies, before they're born.
So how can a country that seems so civilised do this to their youngest members?
But you lost, and it must be hurting, but we'll get our way in the end.
As RTE well knew, dead babies tell no tales.
But we had an issue in Ireland. In the last year there was a referendum.
So it was as if somebody in Google noticed the spike in our ads and said, oh boy, these guys weren't kidding.
What influences over 1 million people to pass sentence on the innocent? And as this ancient people chose their modern purge, who will inherit the land? Is it those who welcome each as a gift, or those who reject new life? This is the inside story of Ireland's abortion referendum. My country of Ireland has undergone a cultural revolution in the last 30 years, changing from one of the most religious countries in the West to a bastion of new and liberal dogmas, where even today people of power and influence are seen clambering over each other to go where no Irish man or woman ever went before, in the race to change society. Though lauded by the press at home and abroad, these changes are a far cry from the values our island once held dear and spread around the world. The crowning example of this revolution was indeed the introduction of abortion in 2018, when 2/3 of Irish voters gave a firm yes to what their ancestors might previously have thought unthinkable. So just how did this all happen? How do people with new ideas take over the levers of power, secularizing what was once decidedly sacred?
I remember years ago, I was lucky enough to be able to interview Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later of course became Pope Benedict. And so what he said to me was that while Ireland might be an island geographically, it's not an island culturally. And so there's no way that Ireland was going to, over the long term and indefinitely, buck the secular trend of other countries. The Catholic Church, because it helped us to maintain an Irish as well as a Catholic identity, was in very good standing by the time 1922 comes along, and then we become obviously independent in that year, and Catholicism remains an extremely important part of our national identity. And so this kind of pushed back the secular trends for a long time.
The church, however, was to go into steady decline, not just because of the abuse scandals that would emerge, but also because of confusion that overtook it following the Second Vatican Council. No longer would religion have pride of place in the Irish imagination, as mass media, money and new ideas began to replace national devotions and long-held cultural standards.
I was reading a book recently called The State of the Nation by Desmond Fennell, and it was very interesting to me because it was a book written in 1983, and he's perfectly encapsulating how there's this kind of, elite, sort of liberal, capitalist kind of media that, it veers liberal, but it's, there's a kind of a capitalist edge to it, and that's always been the case in Ireland, certainly since maybe, what he was saying, since the 60s.
Controlling information has long been key to exerting political influence, and those with the loudest voices will usually determine the outcome of important decisions.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Although media influence was growing in 1980s Ireland, the Catholic Church still had the biggest platform in the country, drawing millions of people to Mass every weekend. This culture allowed pro-life activists to successfully campaign for a constitutional ban on abortion in 1983, with 2/3 of voters endorsing what was known as the Eighth Amendment.
They saw what had happened in the sexual revolution, and particularly in the late 60s, the changes to the law in Britain and in America.
What makes the Irish pro-life movement unique is they saw what was coming and they got ahead of those who were trying to legalize abortion. They inserted protections for preborn children into the Constitution. Those protections held for 35 years, saving hundreds of thousands of lives.
They are completely vindicated in what they did back then.
1992 and 2002 saw major challenges mounted against Irish abortion laws. But there was an even bigger storm brewing as Ireland continued its drift from traditional values.
People often wonder how the Liberal agenda advanced so rapidly in Ireland from a position that seems so contrary to it. And it's a bit of a puzzle, but I think we might answer it by looking at the 3 Ps: patience, persistence, and pressure. Starting from a social and political position that was very much opposed to what they wanted, they began to infiltrate the institutions, education, the media, the universities, and teaching. And gradually, and this, by the way, was in conjunction with changes that were taking place all over the world. Okay, so I mean, they had, if you like, a broader context in which they were working. Things began to change.
Academia was changing in significant ways, challenging boundaries in the pursuit of a new understanding of freedom, one that would put individual wants above all else.
The great kind of horror of the modern mind is the unchosen burden. I didn't choose this burden. In the name of this false compassion, you can eliminate the unborn, leave your family. At the end of life, I can eliminate myself if I consider myself to be a burden, or I can encourage the elimination of a family member who now seems burdensome.
The sexual revolution in particular was coming to fruition in an Ireland that had previously resisted its allures.
Labour Party adopted the Fabian strategy, called after the Roman general Fabius, Commentator, Fabius the Delayer, and his approach was to kind of wear the enemy out, in this case Hannibal, by dragging him all over Italy until the elephants were exhausted. So this is what they did, they operated in this environment.
As more and more Irish graduates came under the influence of postmodern culture, wider society inevitably began to change too, as mass media and academia asserted ever greater control of the national conversation. Positions of power were increasingly being held by those with new and often radical ideas. This might sound good to some people, but Irish students were not being given the tools to distinguish between genuine injustice and propaganda, or to grasp what views should and shouldn't be tolerated. Would it be tolerable to hold a vote on who could be killed, for example? Most people never considered the problem.
There was, I suppose, an appeal to what the Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre would call emotivism. So this is the kind of rejection of reason and of weighing the evidence over emotion, and that actually the exercise of somebody's reason in terms of making a moral choice is seen as nothing more than an emotional reaction.
Many of the recent changes have been brought about by something I suppose we should call compassion, which in itself is a good thing. In other words, to feel as it were at second hand the suffering of somebody else, and to get that to move you to change things, to accommodate and to reduce that suffering. That's a good thing. A soft heart is a good thing. However, a soft head isn't.
Irish youths were no longer being given the values of their ancestors in the state curriculum, a change that hasn't gone unnoticed among some parents today. Pearce's Murder Machine essay points to a classical understanding of education, where students were not just going to school to become employable taxpayers, but were there to learn the ancient wisdom and faith of Western civilization, making a meaningful life more likely, both now and in the hereafter. In gradually rejecting this type of Christian learning, focusing instead on the tools needed for material gain, modern Ireland was laying the foundation for a very different culture, where the good life would be less about virtue and more about vice. By steadily gaining control of universities, mass media, and the corridors of power, Ireland's new establishment now had control of the narrative.
They still tell a story as if they're the sort of brave minority struggling against the tyranny of repression, when they're actually the ones in control. They control the media, they control the universities, they control all the institutions.
They would go on to breed a critical mass of voters in Ireland who were open to everything except the values of their ancestors. Despite this, there still seemed little public appetite for abortion until tragedy struck.
Savita Halappanavar, who was 31 and who died last month in hospital of septicemia. Her widower says she was miscarrying and she would be alive if her request for a termination hadn't been refused.
The media's depiction of Savita's death turned out to be very misleading. She didn't die because of Ireland's ban on abortion, with no less than 3 official inquests finding the real cause of her death.
The medical facts are fairly well known, that she died from sepsis, and that the reason for that was failure to intervene early enough.
Savita Halappanavar was an incredible young woman who did not deserve to die, who should still be alive today, who would still be alive today had those doctors in Galway done their job.
The media and abortion campaigners wanted Savita's death to be all about abortion. They saw it as a tipping point. They saw it as a chance to exploit this woman's death to sway public opinion and to build opposition to the 8th Amendment. And if you look at the reporting on this issue, it's extraordinary. Right across news platforms, not just in Ireland, but right across the world, if you Google or if you look up Savita and abortion, you literally get hundreds of thousands of hits. And there was only a fraction of that coverage given to the findings of the tribunal, which said she actually died of sepsis.
Well, the Savita case was certainly key. I think that there's no doubt about that. The facts of the case were, as we know, I think this is well documented now, was that was a case of hospital negligence. That was a case of Savita, a 31-year-old beautiful woman, going in to have a baby and not getting the right care when everything turned wrong in her particular situation. I think it was more than key. I think it was probably the hinge that changed everything.
The truth doesn't matter to most people. In fact, the truth isn't probably even known to most people. What is inexorably fixed in their mind is that this was brought about by the prohibition on abortion, and therefore it had to be removed.
There were people on the other side of the campaign who, had Savita Halappanavar died as a result of an abortion gone wrong, would never have mentioned her name again. But because she died asking for an abortion, her name will never be forgotten. And that is an unfortunate contrast with many other women who found themselves in circumstances where these same people who call themselves compassionate, who build an entire brand out of being the most caring people in Ireland, couldn't give a damn.
So for example, 9 months before Savita died, a woman called Aisha Shatira travelled from Dublin to a Mary Stopes abortion clinic in London. And after a botched abortion, she bled to death in the back of a taxi. It was absolutely horrific, but it got almost no coverage in the Irish media because they didn't want to tell this story. It ruined their narrative. Their narrative always was that abortion is good for women and we had to repeal the 8th Amendment. And Aisha Shatira did not fit that narrative.
The lie about what caused Savita's death had already spread around the world, with Irish politicians wasting little time in bringing forward legislation that would then allow abortion in limited circumstances. The 2013 law was quickly followed by calls for gay marriage in Ireland, and the blueprint used to engineer this referendum was very clever indeed. Politicians would gather a select group of citizens in a hotel room, present them with information, and then ask to be advised on what course to take. This was called the Constitutional Convention, and the months of deliberations gave the Irish media time to mould public opinion on the matter. Gay marriage would pass at the ballot box in 2015, with campaigners quickly turning their eyes to the 8th Amendment and Ireland's effective ban on abortion.
Today, outside Irish embassies in many countries around the world, Amnesty members are holding vigils calling for Ireland to repeal the 8th Amendment and change its abortion laws.
The same successful strategy of first convening members of the public would be used again. this time rebranded as the Citizens' Assembly.
The purpose of the Citizens' Assembly was to make a set of recommendations that politicians weren't able to make directly, or so they saw it. And to essentially provide them with a mudguard in event that the whole thing went wrong from their point of view. So being able to fall back if you're a politician and say, we're simply implementing the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, it's political gold.
So for an entire 12 months before the referendum, the stage was being set for this vote, and was being set by the government working hand in hand with the media. And they used the Citizens' Assembly and then a parliamentary hearing, the Oireachtas Committee hearing, to create daily news reports in favour of legalising abortion. It was very cleverly done, and this daily barrage of pro-abortion propaganda wore down the Irish people's resistance to abortion. And then we began to see the opinion polls changing. There had never been a majority of Irish people in favour of abortion as a matter of choice or abortion on demand, and we began to see that changing.
You have to remember, at the time that the Citizens' Assembly was convened, there was absolutely no certainty in government or political circles that the referendum would be passed. In fact, there was a widespread belief that a referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment would be lost, or could be lost.
Ireland was also the intense focus of liberal billionaires like Chuck Feeney and George Soros, both of whom gave enormous sums of money to campaign groups for gay marriage and abortion.
A number of Irish organisations seeking to repeal the constitutional ban on abortion have received financing from a human rights fund run by the billionaire investor George Soros.
It'd be easy for me to sit here and say the media didn't cover it, but it's more subtle than that. The media only covered it after they were pushed relentlessly to do so. I remember having conversations with any number of journalists saying, if this was the no side, this would be on the front page.
Foreign billionaires interfering in the Irish democratic process, and the Irish media had almost nothing to say about it.
God forbid some rich pro-life American had provided 1/10 of what Soros provided to the other side. That would have been evidence of horrible, nasty foreign interference.
Interestingly, the documents that were leaked from George Soros's foundation showed that he believed that because Ireland was a Catholic country, a victory there would also lead to changes in abortion laws in other Catholic countries. Ireland has been in the crosshairs of these very powerful, exceptionally well-funded international organisations for years, pushing abortion. We had Julie Kay from the Centre for Reproductive Rights, who funded and took the cases against Ireland to the United Nations and elsewhere, saying that Ireland was the jewel in the crown of the international pro-life movement, and that was a jewel that they wanted to smash.
When I saw the Soros story getting the very muted reaction that it did, there was a sense, an immediate recognition that, you know, we have no prospect of getting fair play in this campaign. There's no way we're going to be held to the same standard that these guys are being held to. So just hunker down and prepare for battle.
This helicopter money from abroad was helping to engineer major social change, but pro-life activists were already mobilising in staggering numbers to counter the effects of this foreign cash and elite support.
From 2013 onwards, everybody knew the referendum was coming, and we were organising and working, and we had thousands of people, the best of people, out working, canvassing. They got to 700,000 doors before the vote, and they gave it everything. Organised huge rallies, did amazing things locally. They were wonderful.
Our campaign had ramped up and been in action and been far superior organisationally, resources-wise, message-wise to the Yes campaign for a good 6 months before the Yes campaign kicked into gear.
To the point where you had journalists writing in the media telling the Yes campaign to get up off their backside because the No campaign was clearly stealing a march.
So at that time, you know, there was reason, and you talked to a lot of people on the No side and they were optimistic. They said, we're getting great reaction on the doorsteps, we think we can defeat this thing. But then you know, if you want to say the storm clouds were gathering.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton.
In our history as our Independence Day.
The political world was changing rapidly, and not everyone was happy about it.
Abbiamo fatto più che bene ad abbandonare questo governo quando ci hanno certificato.
Formar o nosso Brasil em uma grande, livre.
Donald Trump's victory in 2016 was a political earthquake, coming fast on the heels of the popular revolt at the ballot box that was Brexit. These massive shocks to the establishment were blamed on the access that outsiders like Trump and Leave campaigners had to voters via social media. Social media had levelled the playing field to give anti-establishment candidates and messages a fighting chance, with game-changing results. In all the hysteria around Trump and Brexit, one message came through very clearly. The liberal elites in the media and in Silicon Valley were determined this wouldn't happen again.
There is no way that Brexit or Trump or the Italian elections could ever possibly have happened. It was social media that allowed people to get round the back of mainstream media. Now, perhaps you're horrified by this creation of yours.
Everybody got screwed up, so now we're rapidly being like, what happened there? How do we prevent it from happening again?
With their European HQs all located in Dublin, would these social media giants allow a similar upset in the Irish abortion referendum? Or would the real election interference be not from Russia or Republicans, but by the long arm of big tech meddling in the democratic process of a little island in the North Atlantic?
We had an issue in Ireland. There was a referendum.
Every time we were asked about it, we said, yeah, we're going to devote a big chunk of our budget to online advertising. And there was never any controversy about that. Until, I believe, and this is what's very interesting, the decision Google made to suspend advertising came on the very first day that we actually ramped up social media advertising. So it was as if somebody in Google noticed the spike in our ads and said, oh boy, these guys weren't kidding. And so within a couple of hours, I got a phone call from Kieran Conlon, who is used to be Enda Kenny's Director of Communications in government and had since moved to work in Google, informing me that Google had made the decision that they were going to suspend all advertising. And I remember being outraged with him and saying, you know, what is possibly the reason for this? And he just didn't give me one. He said he was going to issue a statement. And essentially what the statement said was that there was a threat to the integrity of the Irish democratic system on foot of advertising in the referendum, and that to protect the country, Google were going to suspend advertising. Now, leave aside for a second the fact that this disproportionately impacted one side of the campaign, a fact which has never been disputed, by the way, and ask yourself this. In any other scenario, or in any other country in the world, where a big corporation says there's a threat to the integrity of the election, therefore we are banning advertising, there would be some follow-up. The authorities would be interested to find out what was the threat to the election that required this massive interference in it by a multinational corporation. And that is an answer that the Irish people deserve to hear, because, do you know, as far as I'm concerned, it was made up. It was an entirely invented form of words, a polite way of saying the danger to the integrity of the election is that the wrong side might win.
I think we would all agree that it's very significant that Yes campaigners rushed out today to welcome this censorship of the no message. Because of course the Yes side in this referendum doesn't need Google to campaign. They already have the journal.ie, tv3.ie, rte.ie, the irishtimes.ie, the dailyedge.ie, and the list simply goes on and on. It was actually reported in the Irish Times that abortion campaigners, Together for Yes, were going to Google regularly and asking them to shut down advertising in the referendum. Because they didn't need it. They already had all of the media in their pocket. They already had Facebook and YouTube and Google behind them. And with 2 weeks to go, with all of that vital messaging from the pro-life side ready to go, Google shut the No campaign down.
It would later emerge that YouTube, owned by Google, had blocked certain search terms during the referendum. a number of Irish journalists did try to call out Google for their foreign interference, but to no avail. This meant Google controlled what Irish voters would see when searching for information, secretly manipulating the situation as a corporate giant and funneling voters towards the mainstream media outlets who were already calling for a yes vote. Tech giants have a history of election interference, however, as professor and researcher Robert Epstein explained to a US Senate committee.
You're not a Republican and nor are you a conservative. Is that accurate?
That would be an understatement.
And indeed, you're the former editor-in-chief of Psychology Today.
Correct.
So you're a respected academic. You testified before this committee that Google's manipulation of votes gave at least 2.6 million additional votes to Hillary Clinton in the year 2016. Is that correct?
That's correct. 2.6 million is a rock bottom minimum. The range is between 2.6 and 10.4 million, depending on how aggressively they used the techniques that I've been studying now for 6.5 years.
Epstein had blown the whistle on how Google search suggestions and their top results manipulate the information getting to voters. But he also had a word to say about Facebook.
Now, you described the Go Vote reminder, and you said it wasn't a public service announcement, but rather manipulation. Can you explain how? I'm not sure everyone followed the details of that.
Well, sure. If on Election Day in 2016, if Mark Zuckerberg, for example, had chosen to send out a Go Vote reminder, say just to Democrats, and no one would have known if he had done this, that would have given that day an additional at least 450,000 votes to Democrats. And we know this without doubt because of Facebook's own published data.
What you mightn't realise is that Facebook presented a Go Vote reminder to Irish voters on the day of the referendum. So I asked Professor Epstein if this was an attempt to influence the outcome of our vote.
If there's any indication that Facebook had some sort of bias regarding that vote, any indication at all, then you can be guaranteed that that vote reminder was a vote manipulation.
Do we have any evidence to show that Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg were rooting for one side in the abortion referendum? Well, we know that Mark Zuckerberg gives to foundations, which gives a lot of money to Planned Parenthood, which is an abortion giant. We know that Mark Zuckerberg was in talks with the Irish government about advertising during the referendum. And the Irish government, of course, were part of the Yes campaign. And we know that pro-life people have always found it difficult to run the kind of campaigns or ads we wanted to on Facebook. Does this all mean Facebook may have favoured one kind of an outcome over another in the abortion referendum? Absolutely.
They would not have sent it to everyone unless they had first looked at the demographics. Remember that differential demographics effect. If they sent it to everyone and they knew that the demographics favored one particular point of view, one particular perspective, then that would have given a lot of extra votes to support that one point of view, in which case that would have been an extremely powerful manipulation, which again, people are unaware of, number one, and number two, it leaves no paper trail, and number three, again, it's not competitive. You can't counteract what they're doing.
And to me, listening to your explanation, there's an irony here because what Facebook talked about during the referendum was the fear of foreign interference, so they banned all foreign ads. But here was a company that isn't native to Ireland making very significant decisions, such as sending Go Vote reminders to X number of voters. So is there a cognitive dissonance ultimately in the minds of these tech giants, or their staff at least?
It's not cognitive dissonance, it's deliberate deception.
We went to the Irish and asked folks there, well, how do you want us to handle this? You have no laws on the books that are relevant. We ended up not allowing the ads.
Facebook had banned foreign ads during the referendum, a step that no one had a problem with. But their Go Vote reminder flew under the radar. When I asked them about the impact their Go Vote reminder had, or if they would acknowledge that this was foreign interference, not surprisingly, I didn't receive any response.
The idea that a fetus at 12 weeks gestation and pregnancy, which is 10 weeks from the time of conception, is fully formed is medically incorrect.
I brought this for you, Peter, actually. It says, by the end of the 3rd month, your baby is fully formed, all the organs and extremities are present and will continue to mature in order to become functional. The circulatory and urinary systems are working and the liver produces bile. There's nothing new after 12 weeks, Peter. It is fully formed. If you don't know that, maybe you need to go back to school, because everybody knows that.
As polling day approached, referendum debates were going well for the no side. So well that Dr. Peter Boylan would later claim that RTE had secretly promised him an immediate right to reply in the last debate. There were question marks, however, about Peter Boylan's foray into politics.
Chairman of the Institute of Obstetricians, Dr. Peter Boylan, took the lead in the campaign. It drew what is supposed to be an independent profession into the political arena. And of course, he is quite free to get involved in the political arena if he wishes. But to draw in the entire obstetrical community as approving what he was doing, which was what the impression people had. Many of my colleagues were very uneasy about the position he was taking.
So medical professionals were key to the referendum, but pro-life doctors and nurses were being shut down by the media. For example, 2 weeks ahead of the vote, we had organised this incredibly important press conference with nurses and midwives, the women who were involved at all levels of maternal health care, to call for a no vote on the referendum. And RTE, the main broadcaster, the main news station in Ireland, came and they recorded a news clip, and the reporter told me she was really happy with it. But it never appeared on the news that night. So I rang and I eventually got to talk to the director, and she said to me that they weren't going to run this really important news item featuring midwives and nurses calling for a no vote because they didn't have the equivalent from the Yes campaign on that day.
The nurses' experience of RTE's editorial decisions didn't seem to be consistent with what RTE told Maria Steen, however.
We were invited to a meeting in RTE with the referendum steering group, and as I recall, there were 5 RTE executives. They explained to us that they had met those on the repeal side, and they were inviting us in to discuss some of the debates, the final debates.
The culture in the media leading into the referendum was overwhelmingly, uniformly in favour of a change in the law.
I think the media was in favour of repealing the 8th, and I think also rowing in behind that was the politics, big business, the establishment in general. So, you know, you've got what amounts to propaganda there when you have those 3 pillars of propaganda all coming to work together.
We said we didn't want any favouritism. All we were asking for was fairness and a level playing pitch. And we gave a number of instances of programmes which we thought were unfair for various reasons. And we were told by John Williams, the Managing Director of News and Current Affairs, that we needed to take the issue of balance or fairness in the round, that some programmes would be happy with and some programmes we wouldn't be happy with. And one of our representatives, Cora Sherlock, made a very good point, saying that, well, you know, some people might only tune in for one programme, so that will be, and it may be the programme that it was unfair to us, and that is the impression they'll be left with, so that wasn't fair. And again, he said, you know, you need to take it in the round. And at that point I said, you know, well, every programme should be fair. You know, it's not that we were looking for an advantage, but just fair. Every programme should be fair. And he looked at me and said, well, you're not going to get that.
The reason I was probably the only person speaking from the point of view that, you know, that we could look at the fact that abortion ultimately for women on balance causes more harm than good, and that there were other options that we could have taken before we brought in abortion. I think the reason why I was the only person doing it, and I don't believe there was anybody else who wasn't connected to an organisation who was actually writing about this or speaking about this in the TV and on the newspapers. But for me, I think the difference with me, because I did have to think about this, I still find the whole thing very painful actually, the whole debate. It was a very difficult time. But I think it was actually class that made me think differently about it, because when you look at the class element and maybe the reasons why abortion was so embraced all of a sudden by our politicians, there's an awful lot of economic conservatism around it. And I think I was one of the few people to question that, because media now, and press particularly, is mostly filled with middle class, quite privileged, and straight out of maybe 4 years of university, which I think we accept now that there's quite a lot of liberal orthodoxy going on there. So I didn't come out of that environment. I came out of a different environment, and I learned a trade in actual newspapers at a time when people who came out of council estates could do that. So I think that I had a different viewpoint on it, possibly because I was distinguished by a different class than most of the media.
All of us that fought hard the time of the referendum, we took a stand, we weren't afraid to do so, and at the time it wasn't popular, certainly in mainstream media.
And even still, we would get people who have Be Kind or, Fight the Hate, etc. on their Twitter accounts spew really negative bile towards people who have a different view.
There was a long run-in of about 2 years before the actual vote, in which there was wall-to-wall coverage of personal stories. And again, this reliance on personal stories inevitably fed into a narrative of choice. There was a personal story that was never heard, and that was that of the baby. And as RTE well knew, dead babies tell no tales.
But then something very interesting happened. As our campaign intensified, the posters went up, the billboards went up, the canvass went on around the country. The polls started to slip for the yes side, and they started to slip quite significantly. This was extraordinary. Despite the fact that the Yes campaign had all of the media, all of the funding, all of the establishment behind them, they were losing ground. And 2 weeks after the referendum, they started to slip below 50% in the polls. That was very bad news for them. So they needed to go back to what worked for them before. They needed to go back to using fear. And they went back to the death of Savita Halappanavar. So in the final days of the campaign, abortion campaigners flew out to India and recorded an emotional video with the parents of Savita. And they used that to urge people to vote yes.
I hope the people in Ireland will remember the fate of our daughter Savita on the day of referendum and vote yes.
So you had RTE and the Irish Times and the entire media establishment waiting for that video, waiting to show it to the entire Irish voting public so that they would believe that if they voted no, other women like Savita would die. In those last few days, it became almost impossible for the truth to be heard. There were more than 1,000 news reports about that video. And this was all happening at a time when Google was shutting down the ability of the No campaign to answer that video and to make our messages heard. That video was the tipping point that swung the vote back up.
It was probably the biggest thing that influenced people's thinking on the question of abortion, despite the facts that could be put out there about the safety of maternity services in Ireland, that standards are higher in this country than they are in the UK. And that is evidenced by a lower maternal mortality. That's the number of mothers who die during childbirth. Those sort of matters didn't seem to penetrate into the consciousness.
The last opinion poll before that video showed that the yes vote had fallen to below 50%. But on referendum day, the yes vote rose to 66%.
The 25th of May 2018 would go down as the day Ireland voted for abortion, the first time in history a country had voted to kill innocent human beings. Despite promising there would be no celebrations, Leo Varadkar joined others in Dublin Castle for a victory lap that would have repercussions in both the north and the south of Ireland.
To see the Taoiseach and the Fianna Fáil leader and the party leaders dancing and prancing around Dublin Castle in an excited manner and in joyous manner, you'd think they had won in All Ireland.
These Irish Republican politicians were standing there holding up a sign threatening the Northern Irish unborn children at Dublin Castle. a place where the British used to rule over Ireland.
We're disgusted at what happened to children in some of the institutions, how babies were treated after they were born, and then we just go and vote to take away the right of babies, before they're born. And not to be able to see the total contradiction there is simply just stunning to me.
We had Mary Lou MacDonald and Michelle Neal going to Westminster to beg the British government to legalise abortion. Sinn Féin has always been about get the Brits out, but yet they brought the Brits in to force abortion onto Northern Ireland. Legislation that will murder innocent unborn children up to the moment of birth, Irish unborn children.
We're celebrating the destruction of human life by such a cruel and crude bill that gave no pain relief even to the babies before they were aborted, or didn't give any sustenance to babies who were born alive.
It reminded me a little bit of the scene, and not every viewer will get this, but the scene at the end of Star Wars, Return of the Jedi, where the Emperor falls and there are celebrations across the galaxy, because it's this idea that the 8th Amendment was the big bad. It's gone, so why wouldn't there be a party? But that lasted one day, and 3 weeks later most of these people were unhappy and they were miserable again, because it was never the 8th Amendment that was making them miserable in the first place. At some point, liberalism has to come to terms with the fact that lots of these people are just plain unhappy and they don't know why. And so gay marriage didn't fix it. Abortion didn't fix it. Euthanasia, when it comes and we're told, as we will be, that the freedom to die has been denied us and this is oppressive, there'll be celebrations then too, and that won't be why they were unhappy either. So I look at those celebrations as sad, but I don't feel sad for me. I feel sad for those people, because they're celebrating defeating something that was never a threat to them in the first place.
Westminster would go on to legalise abortion in the north with the help of both Sinn Féin and the SDLP. But both the British and Irish governments had already passed a legal Rubicon. The entire establishment had assumed that democratic votes could be used to kill innocent human beings, ignoring the limits set by the natural law and pointed to by people like Martin Luther King.
To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law.
The positive law is a law that people decide what's right and wrong. So for example, abortion. People say yes to abortion, okay? So therefore abortion is okay. It is okay to do abortion. It's where the natural law would say no, it's not. And whether the majority agree with it or not, it's still not right. But we as a nation have moved psychologically to saying positive law is the law by which we want to shape our future. So for example, everything Hitler did was legal. The extermination of the Jews was legal. It was a positive law. But the natural law would tell you and I that it wasn't right. And we know in the Nuremberg trials that these were crimes against humanity.
In 2019, the first year of the abortion regime in Ireland, we now know that 6,666 babies were killed by abortion. That's what repeal did. Repeal killed those babies.
The story the media wants you to hear is the story of plucky progressives and feminists who finally dragged Ireland into modernity. The real story is a much different story. It's the story of people who fought for babies that weren't even theirs simply because they cared so deeply for babies.
We came together to support parents when they've been given a life-limiting diagnosis of baby in the womb. We help them let love shine through.
It is the story of those who fought for protections for preborn children, even though those preborn children weren't theirs, because they thought that every single Irish baby deserved to be fought for and was owed the right to life by the society that they were conceived into.
What we say to women is we're with them for as long as they need or want us there. So even after the baby is born, we're there to help them and support them.
The real story is of tens of thousands of men, women, young people who put boots on the ground in a country where abortion was already illegal, who sacrificed their time, sacrificed their money, sacrificed their reputations, sacrificed high-paying jobs, all to ensure that every single baby was fought for and that every single baby would have protection under law. The real story of the Irish pro-life movement is the story of these men and women and the hundreds of thousands of babies that are alive today because those men and women did what they did.
So these things tend to go in cycles. And if you take a wider view, you see, if you look at history of, say, Mesopotamia or Egypt or Rome or Greece, you'll see phases, cultural phases changing one after another in a series of cycles of generally conservative, generally liberal. And they last a certain period of time. They can be compressed or they can be elongated. So what does that mean for us? Does it mean we can do nothing? And the answer is, of course, no. It just means, however, that we have to adopt a strategy of the liberals. We have to be patient, we have to persevere, and we have to persist.
People eventually will begin to understand again what it is that we wear. When you've done little gibblings, when you've done all your searching, you'll arrive back at where you started and know it again for the first time. And I think that we're on that journey to arriving back at where we started and to know it again for the first time.
Birth rates in Ireland and elsewhere have never been lower. These are unprecedented times in human history. Politicians are worried about who will pay for pensions and healthcare, but it also begs the question, who will shape the future? Is it those who welcome every child, or those who, for a variety of reasons including abortion, choose not to have any?
We will never give up on the right to life of every person.
The country that saved hundreds of thousands of lives with the 8th Amendment will see its wheel of history turn full circle again, when every child will once again be given life.